On Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's main islands, is the small town of Saga. They are located just midway between two major centers that in recent years have become well known to thousands of Americans. Sasebo was the home base for most of the American ships involved in the Korean War. American bombers and fighter planes took off from Ashia Airfield and crossed the narrow Tsushima Strait to strike at the forces of China and Red Korea. Saga City had already seen military expeditions traveling across the Tsushima Strait. My ancestors were soldiers in the Japanese army that landed in Korea in 1592, sailing from Saga. The not-so-successful outcome of the modern Korean War also had historical precedent. The medieval Korean-Japanese War turned into a trench warfare in 1597 when the Chinese Ming dynasty moved its troops to help North Korea. Similarly, modern Red China came to the aid of the Korean communists. My ancestors were warriors and faithfully served Prince Saga for generations, until the centralization of Japan began in the 19th century and the prince placed his holdings at the disposal of the emperor. During feudalism, Japan's population was divided into 4 castes, and my family belonged to the ruling class of samurai. Freed from the pesky cares of everyday life, the samurai lived proudly and freely, unencumbered by the trivialities of money and the like. He devoted all his time to managerial affairs and to perfecting his martial art, which could be required at any moment. Everything necessary for the life of a samurai was provided by the prince, regardless of the harvest or any other circumstances. When the caste system was abolished in the 19th century, it was a crushing blow to the samurai class. In one fell swoop, they were stripped of all their old privileges and were forced to become farmers and traders, to begin a life for which they were totally unsuited. Hence, as might be expected, most of the samurai fell into poverty. They tried to make a living by menial labor, or toiled from morning till night on their tiny farms. My own grandfather lived no better than the rest. Eventually, he managed to buy a tiny farm that he used to make ends meet. My family then and today was one of the poorest in the village. It was on this farm that I was born on August 26, 1916. I was the third of 4 sons, and besides us there were 3 daughters in the family. Strangely enough, my own life was much the same as my grandfather's. When Japan surrendered to the Allies in 1945, I was the best surviving Japanese ace. I had 64 enemy planes shot down. However, after the war ended, the Imperial Navy was disbanded, and I found myself on the street. I had no money and no profession that would be useful in a collapsing world. Like my grandfather, I lived by hard manual labor, and it was only after a few years that I managed to save up a small sum and buy a small bookstore, which allowed me to feed myself. All the work on the tiny family farm near the town of Saga fell on the shoulders of my mother, who also had to support 7 children. This was because she was widowed when I turned 11. As far as I remember her at that time, she was always working in the fields, and my younger sisters were clinging to her skirt. But I don't remember a single word of complaint escaping her lips. She was the bravest woman I ever knew, a true samurai, proud and firm. However, when needed, she knew how to find a warm word for us. Sometimes I would come home from school beaten up by older and stronger boys. She did not sympathize with my tears in the least, only frowned and shamed me. Shame on you. Don't forget that you are the son of a samurai, and tears are not for you. I did my best to study as well as possible, and therefore in our village elementary school all 6 years was considered the first in my class. But continuing my education seemed an insoluble problem. While elementary school were funded by the government, most high schools had to be paid for by the student's family. Finding the money for this was simply not an option for the Sakai family, as we barely had enough money for food and clothing. But we underestimated the generosity of my uncle who lived in Tokyo. Out of the blue, he offered to pay my school fees. My uncle was a wealthy official and served in the Ministry of Communications. He offered to take me into his house and pay my tuition. We gratefully accepted this generous offer. In feudal Japan, the Saga clan owned one of the most impoverished provinces. Its samurai lived more than modestly for many years and were famous for their Spartan discipline. We were the only province in Japan that sacredly honored the Bushido Bible, the Hagakure, whose main theme was, The samurai lives in such a way that he is always prepared to die hagakur, became a textbook in every Japanese school during the war. But it was the code according to which I lived my whole life. Its rigid requirements helped me many times both in my new school life and in my subsequent soldiering life. In Tokyo, I was struck by literally everything. I had never seen a city larger than Saga, which had only 50,000 people. To imagine 1 million people in the Japanese capital, the constant hustle and bustle and noise, the huge buildings I simply could not imagine. In addition, I found that in Tokyo 1929 there was continuous and fierce competition in all areas of life. Not only were school leavers fighting hard for jobs, but even boys were fighting equally hard for places in selective schools. I thought my life on the farm was hard. I thought I was the best pupil in my school for the last 6 years. But I had never met middle schoolers who literally studied day and night, who tried to pummel their classmates in every spare minute. The most able middle school students chose high schools in Tokyo, like first or fourth. Moreover, out of 25 applicants, only 1 would get into these schools. For a country boy like me, completely overwhelmed by the frenzied pace of life in the capital, it was unthinkable for me to break into these illustrious schools. So I willingly agreed to become a student at Aoyama Gaikun, established a few years ago under the American mission. Although it could not equal the best schools, it nevertheless enjoyed a certain reputation. My new home life could not have been better. My uncle was a serious man, however, and was convinced that if a child could not be seen or heard, it was the best option. But my aunt, her sons and daughter treated me exceptionally well. It was under such hothouse conditions that I started high school with ambition and enthusiasm. I was quite sure that I would once again take my rightful place as the best in the class. Less than a month later, all those dreams evaporated. My hopes of becoming the top of the class again were dashed. It became clear not only to my teachers, but also to myself that my comrades, who had never been the luminaries of thought, had surpassed me in their studies. I could hardly believe it. Alas, they knew much that I had not even suspected. Despite many hours spent nightly over a textbook, I could not absorb the material as quickly as they did. The first semester ended in July. My grades immediately relegated me to the middle of the class, which was a severe disappointment to my uncle, and threw me into despair. I knew that my uncle had borne the expense of my education, because he thought I was a capable child who could be the best among the students. No wonder he was deeply saddened by my failures. Therefore, summer vacation became a period of intense study for me. While my classmates were having fun, I spent the whole summer working on my textbooks, determined to fill the gaps in my knowledge. However, already the beginning of the school year showed the futility of my efforts. There was no improvement. These repeated failures to become a first grader again caused me a sense of deep despair. Not only had I become a hopeless mediocrity in my studies, in sports I was also beginning to fall behind my comrades. There was no doubt that many of the boys at school were more agile and more capable than I was. This disappointment was a terrible blow to me. Instead of continuing to try to surpass those students who had surpassed me, I chose my comrades among the similarly average students. I tried to quickly become a leader among these underclassmen, and then tried to give battle to the school leaders. Not a day went by that I did not try in one way or another to get the older ones and challenge them to a fight, during which I beat my opponent heartily. Almost every night I returned to my uncle's house bruised, but I tried to keep these skirmishes a secret. I received my first blow after my first year at Methodist school, when my teacher wrote a letter to my uncle informing him that he thought I was a difficult student. The only thing I could do was to stop the unnecessary bickering. But I made no attempt to stop what I saw as a way to assert myself, a way to prove that I was better than the older students. The teacher's letters became more frequent, and finally my uncle was called to the school to tell him about my disreputable behavior. I finished my second year of school almost last of all. It was too much for my uncle. He lectured me in an increasingly irritated tone, and then decided that there was no point in my staying in Tokyo. In parting, he said, "Saburo, I'm tired of bringing you up, and I don't intend to do it anymore. It may be my fault for not keeping a good eye on you, and the result is that I have apparently turned a child of the ancient Sakai surname into a complete thug. You must return to Saga. Apparently, the life in Tokyo is not for you. I couldn't say a single word in my defense, because everything he said was pure truth. All the blame was on me, and that made the shameful return to Saga all the more bitter. I was determined to keep my shame a secret, especially from Uncle Hatsuo's daughter, whom I liked very much. I passed off my return as a normal trip to visit my family. However, when the train pulled away from Tokyo Central Station at night, I could not hold back my tears. I had dishonored my family name, and now I was simply afraid to return home. I returned having become a disgrace to my family and to the entire village. To make matters worse, my family was suffering from poverty and distress. My mother and older brothers labored on the tiny farm from sunrise to sunset. They and my 3 sisters dressed in drab rags, and the small house I was born in was a wreck. When I left for Tokyo, literally every villager saw me off with good wishes, all of them hoping for my success. And now, even though I had embarrassed them, no one reproached me with a single word. There was reproach in their eyes, but they looked away so as not to embarrass me. I did not dare to walk through the village because I was ashamed of the people. I could not bear their silent reminder. My fiercest desire was to flee from the place of my shame. And then I remembered the big poster at the railroad station in Saga, calling for volunteers to join the Navy. Enlisting seemed the only way out of my predicament. My mother, who had already not seen me for several years, did not approve of my desire to leave again, but there was simply nothing else to do. On May 31st, 1933, I turned myself into a 16-year-old recruit at the Sasebo Naval Base, located only 50 miles from my home. It was the beginning of a new life, with its monstrously harsh discipline and hardships that far exceeded my worst nightmares. These days, the memorized samurai code of Hagakure, hidden in the foliage, came to my rescue. It is very difficult, if not impossible in principle, for Americans and other Westerners to accept the ruthless discipline that prevailed in our Navy in those days. The non-commissioned officers, without a moment's hesitation, beat recruits severely if they thought they deserved punishment. When I committed a breach of discipline or made a mistake in drill, a non-commissioned officer would drag me out of the ranks by the scruff of my neck. Recruit Sakai, stand against the wall. Tilt, he yelled. I'm not doing this because I hate you, but because I love you. And I want to make a good sailor out of you. Tilt. And then he would bring a thick wooden stick down on my ass-end stern with all his might. The pain was terrible, and the blows came in hail. I had no choice but to grit my teeth and try not to scream. Sometimes I received up to 40 blows on my ass. Often I would pass out from the pain. But passing out didn't mean you could get away with it. The non-commissioned officer would simply pour a bucket of cold water over my head, then put me back in my original position and continue the disciplinary action until he thought I had learned my lesson well. The brass wanted to make each individual recruit do his best to prevent his comrades from making too many mistakes. To do this, when one of us was being punished, the other 50 recruits in the platoon would also bend over and receive one brutal blow each. After that, we simply could not sleep on our backs. Moreover, we were not allowed to even express our displeasure with a sigh. If even one person moaned in pain or longing during this fatherly education, the whole platoon would immediately receive a full program. Such treatment was the result of the utter ruthlessness of the non-commissioned officers, who were real tyrants to us and enjoyed unlimited rights. Most of them were about 30 years old, and the rank of non-commissioned officer was the ceiling of their military career. Their main solace was to terrorize the recruits. We considered these men to be vicious sadists of the worst kind. During 6 months of unheard of brutal training, they turned each of us into speechless cattle. We never dared to discuss orders, question authority, or hesitate to obey a command. We became obedient, unthinking automatons. When I finished my primary military training course, I was no longer the ambitious, ardent young man who had left his village a few years earlier to conquer the Tokyo school. My failure in my studies, my family's shame, and military discipline all combined to completely break me. I recognized the futility of trying to challenge the right of those above me, My selfishness was beaten out of me completely. But my deep-seated hatred for the atrocities of non-commissioned officers did not weaken over the years, even after graduation. After training in the barracks, I was sent as an apprentice sailor on the battleship Kirishima. Life at sea was a new shock for me. I naively thought that after the brutal initial training, the rough treatment from higher-ups would stop. Well, it didn't. In fact, it became even worse than before. All this time I stubbornly maintained my desire to move forward, to improve my skills and to break out of the ranks of ordinary sailors. During the day I had no more than an hour of free time, but I devoted this time to reading textbooks. My goal was to enter one of the Navy's special schools. Only there could a volunteer receive the special training and knowledge necessary for production to the next rank. In 1935, I successfully passed the entrance exams to the Navy Artillery School. After 6 months, I received the rank of Sailor First Class and went to sea again. This time I got on the battleship Haruna, where I worked in one of the main caliber turrets. The situation improved somewhat. After serving on the Haruna for a few months, I stepped up to the next step, earning the rank of Non-Commissioned Officer Third Class. The Imperial Japanese Armed Forces were divided into two branches, the Army and the Navy. Both branches of the armed forces had their own air forces. The question of creating an independent air force before and during World War II was not even touched upon. In addition, Japan did not have the Marine Corps in the form that the United States had a separate independent corps. Separate Army and Navy units practiced amphibious operations and served as Marines. In the mid-30s, all naval pilots received their initial training at the Tsuchiura Naval Flight School, located 50 miles northeast of Tokyo. The school had 3 classes for ensigns who had graduated from the Naval Academy in Tajima, for non-commissioned officers already serving in the Navy, and for young men who wished to begin naval service as cadets. After Japan went to war with the United States, the Navy had to hastily expand its pilot training system in a desperate attempt to begin stamping out pilots en masse. In 1937, however, no one had even thought of this mass training system. Pilot training was conducted very carefully, only the best candidates were selected. Only a small fraction of eager applicants were admitted to Tsuchiura. In 1937, when I began my training, only 70 people were selected for the flight school out of more than 1,500 applicants. My joy knew no bounds when I saw my name on the lists of the 70 accepted non-commissioned officers. It brought me some satisfaction, for enrollment in TSU Shiru washed away the shame of failure at the Tokyo school. It restored honor to my family and my village, and renewed the hopes that everyone had placed in me. It is easy to imagine my joy when, during my first vacation, I visited my uncle's house in Tokyo. I was no longer a worthless, naughty teenager who was lost when confronted with any difficulties. I was a young, 20-year-old man in a gleaming naval aviator's uniform and 7 gold buttons. I was very proud of myself, but most of all I wanted to hear congratulations from my family. When I saw my cousin Hatsu, I was slightly startled. The little schoolgirl had disappeared, and her place was taken by a very beautiful girl who had turned 15. Hatsuo greeted me warmly, much warmer than our kinship obliged. Afterward, we had a long talk with my uncle, who had always taken a great part in my fate. I noted with satisfaction that he was delighted to see me in a naval uniform and enjoyed discussing the problems of promotion. He was proud of me again, and this was of the utmost importance to me after I had let him down big time in the past. My visit to my uncle's house, meeting him and his family, with Hatsuo, stayed in my memory for a long time. After dinner, we were alone in the room, and Hatsuo honored me by playing the piano for me. She was hardly a true virtuoso, as she had only started studying 3 years ago. However, I was not a music critic, and to me her playing seemed the height of perfection. The solemn sounds of Mozart's music, my first visit to my uncle's house in many months, and my warm encounter with Hatsuo warmed my heart. It was inexpressibly pleasant to see this place of peace and joy after the atrocities of the military schools. I literally floated up to heaven. But the visit was short, and soon I returned to the school. The Tsuchiura training camp is located on the shore of a large lake. Nearby is an airfield with 2 runways 3,000 and 2,200 yards long. The huge hangars could accommodate hundreds of airplanes, and the airbase was always bustling with feverish activity. I will probably never cease to be amazed at what awaited me at each new stage of training. As soon as I arrived at the new school, I discovered that all my previous ideas about naval discipline were far from the truth. I realized with amazement that all the disciplinary rigors at Sasebo Base were a pleasant warm-up before Tushura. Even naval artillery school seemed like kindergarten compared to flight school. A fighter pilot must be aggressive and resilient. Always those were the words the physical training instructor greeted us with as we gathered together in the gymnasium. Here at Tushura, you must develop these qualities of yours or you will never become a Navy pilot. And he, without wasting any time, began to show us in an object-oriented manner how he was going to develop a permanent aggressiveness in us. The instructor picked 2 cadets at random from the group and ordered them to fight. The winner would leave the mat. His opponent, who lost the bout, was less fortunate. He remained on the mat and had to engage in a duel with another cadet. While he lost, he remained on the mat, exhausted beyond belief, battered and battered. Often this ended in serious injury. Otherwise, he had to take turns fighting all the other 69 cadets in our class. If he could still stand on his feet after the 69 fights were over, he received a pardon. But only for one day. The next day he had to fight the first opponent again, and so on. This went on until he was victorious, or he was expelled. Each of the cadets was determined to stay in flight school, so the wrestling matches often took on a violent character. Very often it was necessary to carry away unconscious cadets. However, this did not exempt them from what the superiors considered to be absolutely essential training. They were brought to their senses with a bucket of water and sent back to the mat. After a month of theoretical training on the ground, we received our first lessons in flying skills. Flying was done in the mornings, classroom training in the afternoons. After dinner, we would get 2 hours for self-training and then debarkation would follow. Time passed and the number of cadets was slowly decreasing. Training courses demanded from us the utmost tension, and cadets were expelled for the slightest provocation. Since naval pilots were considered the elite of the fleet, and in general all the armed forces, they were not forgiven for any mistake. During 10 months of training, 45 cadets out of 75 who entered the school were expelled. The instructors did not use such severe physical punishment as I had previously encountered, but it was in their power to immediately throw out any cadet on any pretext. And this we feared far more than the most severe beatings. The exceptional rigidity of the requirements was demonstrated to us just before graduation. The day before graduation, one of the cadets was expelled. A military patrol caught him in an underground bar in Tushura City, where he had gone to celebrate his graduation. It turned out that he had been a bit hasty. Upon returning to the barracks, he was ordered to report to the class office immediately. Realizing what it smelled like, the cadet simply collapsed on his knees in front of the officers, but in vain. The school authorities decided that he was guilty of 2 unpardonable offences. Of the first he, like any pilot, was well aware. No combat pilot for any reason should not drink alcoholic beverages on the eve of the flight. During the final exams tomorrow, we were to fly in close formation over the airfield. The second offence was more understandable, but it was not considered less serious. No sailor should dishonour the Navy by appearing in places that were considered forbidden. Physical training at Tushura was among the most serious in Japanese military schools. One of the most unpleasant tests was an iron pole that we were forced to climb. At the top of the pole we had to hang from one arm. Any cadet who could not hang on for 10 minutes would get a hard kick in the ass and would be sent back to the pole. At the end of training, those cadets who avoided expulsion could hang on one arm for 15 to 20 minutes. Every cadet in the Imperial Navy had to know how to swim. There were many cadets among us who had grown up in mountainous areas and had never swam at all. The method of training was extremely simple. A cadet was tied with a rope under his arms and dragged out to sea, where he could swim or drown. Today, when I am 39 years old, and there are shell fragments in my body, I can still swim 50 meters in 34 seconds. In flight school, a lot of people could swim that distance in less than 30 seconds. Every cadet had to be able to swim at least 50 meters underwater and stay underwater for at least 90 seconds. The average person could hold his breath for 40, even 50 seconds by sheer force of will, but that was not enough for a Japanese pilot. My own record of staying underwater was 2 minutes and 30 seconds. We jumped off the flipboard hundreds of times to improve our sense of balance. This was to help control the fighter plane when performing aerobatics. There was a special reason to pay extra attention to jumping, because as soon as the instructors felt we had mastered the board, we were ordered to jump from the tower onto solid ground. During the jump, we had to do 2 or 3 somersaults and land on our feet. Of course, some of us made mistakes, and this had fatal consequences. Acrobatics was an important part of our physical training, and all the instructors' requirements had to be fulfilled, otherwise expulsion was inevitable. Walking on our hands was considered quite ordinary. We had to learn to stand on our heads, first for 5 minutes, then for 10, until many cadets learned to stand like that for 15 minutes and more. Personally, I managed to bring my personal record of standing on my head for 20 minutes. During this time, my comrades smoked cigarettes and put them in my mouth. Of course, these circus tricks were by no means the only things that were required of us. However, they allowed us to develop an amazing sense of balance and muscle coordination. These qualities saved the lives of many later. Every cadet in Tsushiro had exceptional eyesight, but this was the minimum necessary requirement. Every opportune moment was used to train peripheral vision. We learned to distinguish distant objects even at a quick glance. In short, we practiced the things that were supposed to give us an advantage over enemy pilots. One of our favorite competitions was to try to see the brightest stars during daylight hours. This is very difficult and requires exceptionally sharp eyesight. However, our instructors comforted us with the fact that spotting an enemy fighter from a distance of several thousand meters is no easier than seeing a star in the daytime. And the pilot who first notices the enemy and begins to maneuver to get to the initial position for the attack will have a decisive advantage in the battle. With much training, we became ace star hunters. And then we had to move on. When we spotted a star, we would take our eyes off to the side and instantly turn back to determine if we could see it immediately. These are the little things that make up a fighter pilot. Personally, all these exercises helped me a lot, although they may seem strange to those who are unfamiliar with the tense, changing every second environment of deadly air combat. As far as I can remember, out of my more than 200 encounters with enemy aircraft, barring 2 small blunders, enemy fighters never once took me by surprise. In addition, I never lost any of my wingmen to enemy attacks. While we were studying in Tsushiro, we spent all our free time trying to find methods to improve our reactions and accuracy of movement. A favorite exercise was to catch a fly on the fly with our hand. We probably looked silly waving our arms in the air at the time. But within a couple months, a fly that ventured in front of the face of either of us met its imminent end. The ability to make sharp and precise movements is extremely important when sitting in the cramped cockpit of a fighter jet. These efforts to improve my reactions helped me in a completely unexpected way. The 4 of us were driving a car at 60 mph on a narrow road when the driver lost control and the car went over the curb. We all threw open the car doors and flew out. Everyone got their fair share of bruises and scrapes, but no one was seriously hurt, even though the car was totaled. 25 cadets, including myself, made up the 38th graduating class of non-commissioned officers at Tsushiro, graduating in 1937. I was named the best cadet of the year and received a silver watch from the Emperor as a reward. These 25 men were all that remained of the 70 cadets chosen from among 1,500 applicants. We underwent extensive and rigorous training. However, before we were sent to China, where hostilities began in July 1937, we had to undergo additional training in formation squadrons. Although we were trained very thoroughly, several of the men in my group were shot down before they had even managed to score a single victory themselves. Even I, despite my extraordinary piloting talent, could have met my death in the first battle if my opponent had acted even slightly more aggressively. I must admit that in my first battle I acted clumsily and timidly, and only the support of my comrades and the lack of skill of the enemy saved my life. For me, air combat has always been a difficult and tedious task that caused almost unbearable tension. Even after I had fought several battles and had already shot down several enemy planes, I always came out of an air battle all sweaty. There is always a minimal chance of making an imperceptible mistake that means a funeral pyre. You can brilliantly perform all the aerobatics, turns, loops, barrel rolls, Immelmann's peaks, candles, but one single minuscule mistake puts an end to it. Of the 25 people who graduated from the school with me, I was the only one left alive. A long and difficult air war, which in the early days was extremely favourable for us, gradually turned into a terrible nightmare when we had to fight against the steadily increasing enemy forces, fighting without any hope of success. In the 1930s, the Japanese Navy trained about 100 pilots each year. Very rigid selection and the practice of constant attrition resulted in several thousand quite qualified cadets being reduced to 100 or fewer trained pilots. Had the Navy had additional funds to roll out the training program and had some relief from the simply unbearable conditions of pilot training, I think our situation during World War II would have been much easier. I have no doubt that the outcome would have been the same, but the ruthless extermination of our Air Force that took place in the last 2 years of the war would not likely have been repeated. Only after the outbreak of war in the Pacific, the gradual decline in the number of experienced pilots confirmed the need to urgently organize the supply of replenishments, which forced the Navy to reconsider the system of pilot training. But it was already too late. The qualifications of pilots trained during the war years were questionable at best. I firmly know that the 45 cadets expelled from my class at Tsuchiura were far superior to the pilots who had gone through the military training program. After graduation, we were assigned to various squadrons for formation training. I was sent to the Oita and Omura naval air bases in northern Kyushu. Both here and there, training was conducted for flights from land-based airfields and aircraft carriers. My acquaintance with the aircraft carrier pilots was a shock to me. Their mastery of aerobatics was simply amazing. I doubted that all my art, acquired over years of training, would have allowed me to even come close to them. I found it particularly difficult to master landing on an aircraft carrier. After a month of grueling practicing approaches and touches and new approaches, repeats and repeats, I managed to overcome all the problems. But the strangest thing about the result was that I had never once in my life operated from an aircraft carrier in combat. All my combat sorties up to the last were flown from land-based airfields. After 3 months of intensive training on the aircraft carrier and shore airfields, I received orders to arrive at Gaisun Air Base on Formosa, which then belonged to Japan. The pace of life had changed dramatically. The Chinese war was already raging with unrelenting fury on the entire vast front. It is therefore not at all surprising that fighter pilots, even as green as I was at the time, were urgently needed. From Formosa, I was sent to Jiujiune in southeastern China, and in May 1938 I was in combat for the first time. However, my combat debut could not be called successful. The commander of the Zhejiang Air Regiment did not allow young pilots to fly regular combat missions, as he feared that their inexperience would be too conspicuous against the background of the actions of veterans who had long fought in China. So for a few days I flew only assault sorties in support of the Army's actions. These sorties were hardly dangerous. The Japanese Army was crushing the enemy on the ground, and the Chinese offered little resistance in the air. As the weeks passed, I slowly began to resent being used only in an attack role. I was energetic and ambitious. I was proud of my rank of Naval Aviator Second Class, and was determined to prove my mettle in combat with enemy aircraft. On May 21st, I was finally happy to see my name on the list of 15 fighter pilots who were to fly a sortie to the Hankou area the next day. This sortie could well end in combat, as Hankou at that time was the main air base of nationalist China. In 1938, the Zero fighter, which I later became very familiar with, had not yet entered service with the combat squadrons. We flew the Mitsubishi Type 96 fighter, which the Allies later called the Claude. It was a slow-moving, short-range machine. It had non-retractable landing gear and an open cockpit. Our 15 fighters flew out of Zhejiang in the early morning hours of May 22nd. Formed in 5 wedges, we began to gain altitude. Visibility was excellent. The 90-minute flight from our airfield northwest to Hankou was more like a serene training flight than anything else. Not a single interceptor rose to attack us. Not a single anti-aircraft gun fired after us. It was hard to believe there was a war going on below. From 10,000 feet, the Hanko airfield looked completely deceptive. The bright green grass glistened in the morning sun, and most of all the enemy airbase looked like a perfectly manicured golf course. But fighter planes don't use any sports facilities, and those 3 dots that glided over the ground, gaining altitude, were heading towards us and were enemy fighters. Quite suddenly they were at the same altitude as us, and immediately became large, black and menacing. Without any warning, I, at any rate, was amazed at this. One of the enemy planes left the formation and rushed at me with threatening speed. All the grandiose plans I had made for the first battle instantly evaporated. I felt all my muscles suddenly tense up. I hate to remember it today. I literally shook with excitement and fright when I realized that the enemy plane had chosen me as a target. I often think I acted just plain stupidly at that moment, and the reader may agree with me. However, I must remind you that our mental faculties at 10,000 feet, after a long flight in oxygen-deprived conditions, were slightly dulled, and we were not the same as on the ground. At that altitude, the air is thinner and therefore less oxygen reaches the brain. The roar of the engine in the open cockpit is deafening, as is the whistle of the icy wind rushing past the windshield. But with all this, the pilot must never lose focus for a second. I was constantly turning my head, looking in all directions so as not to be taken by surprise, working the control knob, rudder pedals, throttle section, carefully watching the instruments. In short, I was completely out of my mind. But I was helped by the habits I had learned during my training. In battle, it was necessary at all costs to fulfill the most important order. Always keep to the tail of the lead fighter of your trio. With convulsive movements, I tightened the straps of my oxygen mask and pushed the throttle sector forward as far as it would go. The engine roared resentfully in response, and the fighter literally leaped forward. Some objects flickered in the air around me, and the other Japanese pilots threw the handles of the outboard tanks, and I had completely forgotten to get rid of that flammable object hanging under my fuselage. My hand was shaking and I missed the tank drop handle. I was the very last one to get rid of it. I was completely confused. Everything I was doing wrong. I had forgotten all the basic rules of air combat. I didn't see a single enemy airplane, and I couldn't tell if they were shooting at me or not. All I could see was the tail of my lead. In desperation, I clung to it, and from the outside it must have seemed that our fighters were tied together by an invisible rope. Finally, I took the position prescribed to the wingman behind and slightly to the side of the master, and then began to gradually come to my senses. I was no longer spinning around in the cockpit like a blind man. Taking a deep breath, I dared to look to the left. And just in time, 2 swift enemy fighters were rushing straight at my plane. They were Russian-built I-16s, which had retractable landing gear. Their engine was much more powerful than Claude's, so the I-16s were faster and more maneuverable. And I embarrassed myself again. You could say that in those seconds I was lucky to be born a second time. My hands were twitching randomly, I just didn't know what to do. Instead of turning sideways or changing altitude, I just kept flying in a straight line. By all the laws of air warfare, I should have been shot down at this point. But all of a sudden, both Russian fighters turned away just as I was about to be in their sights. I just couldn't believe my miraculous rescue. But the answer was simple. Assuming that I would lose my head in my first battle as it happened. The squadron commander ordered one of the experienced pilots to cover me from behind. It was he who forced the enemy planes to turn away as he threw his fighter into a steep turn and rushed at them. I, on the other hand, still couldn't do anything sensible. I had jumped out of the death trap and was now flying nowhere, not seeing or noticing anything. I didn't even realize that as a result of my chaotic maneuvers, I was 450 yards behind one of the Russian planes. I just sat in the cockpit and tried to calm myself down enough to do anything at all. Finally, I came out of my tetanus and looked ahead. A Russian fighter loomed in my crosshairs, and then I pressed the throttle. Nothing happened. I pulled the throttle and banged on it, cursing the jammed machine guns. Only then did I notice that I had engaged the enemy planes without taking the safety off the machine guns. The non-commissioned officer flying to my left lost patience watching me flail around the cockpit. He threw his plane forward and fired a line at the fleeing enemy. The bullets flew past the enemy fighter, which turned sharply to the right and sped away only 200 yards from me. But now I was ready and pulled the trigger too. The machine guns spit out a burst of lead, but also missed. I had missed another brilliant opportunity. But now I vowed to shoot down the Russian fighter, even if I had to ram it to do it. I gave full throttle and began to close in on him. The enemy pilot tossed his machine from side to side, performed snakes, and each time successfully dodged my bursts. His sharp turns and attempts to catch me in his sights were unexpectedly clumsy. His own lines ploughed harmlessly through the air far away from me. In fact, the enemy pilot didn't stand a chance. I didn't realize it, but several clods that were circling above us were ready to swoop down on the Russian fighter at any moment, should I suddenly find myself in a dangerous situation. The enemy realized this, and therefore concentrated all his efforts on trying to save himself rather than on shooting me down. And he accomplished his task. I made a steep turn, saw the I-16 only 150 yards in front of me, and put a line directly into its engine. The next moment, fat black smoke billowed out of the enemy fighter, and it went down. Only when the I-16 exploded, falling to the ground, I realized that I had used up all the ammunition, which was strictly forbidden to do. Every fighter pilot must save some ammunition for the return trip if he suddenly encounters enemy fighters. I began to look around frantically, trying to see my comrades, and my heart sank when I discovered that I was all alone. I had broken away from the group. My victory was a travesty, for my comrades had handed it to me on a silver platter, and I had lost them chasing a Russian fighter. I burned with humiliation, remembering my foolish actions, and almost with difficulty held back tears. Finally, I came to my senses and looked around again. Only now I noticed 14 clawed fighters flying in close formation. They were patiently waiting for me to join them. I think that in another 5 minutes I would have just cried with shame. When we landed in Zhejiang, I climbed out of the cockpit completely exhausted. My wing commander came running to my airplane, flaming with rage. He yelled, "Sakai. Of all the... You're a fucking asshole, Sakai. It's a miracle you're still alive. I've never seen more idiotic piloting in my entire life." He choked with anger and fell silent. I stared at the ground, not even trying to object. I feared he would lose his temper and lash out at me with his fists. Yet somehow he managed to hold back. The commander did the worst thing he could think of. He just turned his back on me and walked away. Even today, I do not know who was the nationality of the enemy pilot who was flying a Chinese fighter built in Russia. There was every reason to believe that Russian volunteers were taking Soviet airplanes across the border, but we never found the body of a Russian pilot in the wreckage of a downed airplane. Our Navy had reliable evidence that pilots of the Foreign Legion were fighting in the Chinese Air Force. They were people of various nationalities, who flew different types of fighters, as we encountered not only Russian airplanes, but also American, British, German and others. Occasionally, however, Chinese nationalists flew these airplanes. We learned for sure that one American-built fighter plane was being flown by an American pilot when the plane crashed near Shanghai. Our soldiers immediately arrived at the crash site and returned with the body of the pilot. According to the documents they found, they established that the pilot was an American. My victory over the Soviet fighter jet helped erase the memories of my bad actions. The next day, I immediately painted a blue star on the fuselage of my clawed fighter, now sporting 6 stars. Japanese pilots, especially non-commissioned officers, did not fly the same airplane all the time. The base had more than enough airplanes, and we took any machine, just to fly out at the appointed time. More than once or twice this helped an inexperienced pilot. The enemy pilot, noticing a dozen or more stars on the fuselage, preferred not to engage in battle with the formidable ace. The conflict in China was the wrong war. In our armed forces it was not even called a war. Everyone talked about the Sino-Japanese incident. I believe the exact same situation occurred in America when the US threw large forces into Korea. The American Congress did not officially declare war, and it was considered a police action. Long before that, our government acted in exactly the same way. We did not declare war, so everything was limited to an incident. As soon as it became profitable, we set up a puppet government headed by General Wang Jingwei, a prominent Chinese leader who had openly broken with Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang. The most surprising aspect of this conflict, however, was the violent struggle that developed between the Kuomintang and the Communist Party. At every opportunity, the Communists attacked nationalist troops who were retreating under the blows of our army. To fight the Japanese on land, China had huge armies of millions of soldiers who outnumbered our troops many times over. However, the colossal numerical superiority rarely benefited the Chinese, as their troops were poorly trained and poorly armed. Time after time, the wild hordes of the enemy attacked our perfectly equipped troops and immediately rolled back, suffering monstrous losses. Even material assistance from the Allies, who delivered arms through Burma, Mongolia and Xinjiang, did not help to eliminate the qualitative disparity. Of course, these supplies supported the enemy. They were what allowed Chiang to retreat to Chongqing in relative order, but never once did even foreign arms and equipment help the Chinese launch a serious offensive against us. It was a one-sided war until Japan's surrender to the Allies in August 1945. However, all this does not mean that Japan conquered, or at least tried to conquer the large population of China or to occupy its vast territory. That was simply physically impossible. Instead, our troops occupied key cities in strategically important areas, cut enemy communications, and then imposed retribution on the millions of Chinese peasants at the mercy of the Japanese occupation forces. Outside these walled major cities, gruesome death awaited any Japanese. Only large troop formations could move across the country. The Chan guerrillas, as well as the Chinese communists, ambushed literally everywhere and sought to destroy those soldiers who fell into their hands. Our officers were also well aware that Chinese officials in the occupied cities, despite all flattery and demonstrated willingness to cooperate, were in fact in constant communication with bands of guerrillas roaming the countryside and mountains. In many cases, such contacts were made with the express consent of the Japanese command. It was indeed a strange war. Many times I flew out to support our infantry units and gazed in amazement at the picture unfolding below. I saw Chinese farmers laboring in their fields, oblivious to the fierce hand-to-hand fighting or fierce firefights between Japanese and Chinese soldiers taking place quite nearby. Several times I flew over the streets of towns besieged by our troops and subjected to the heaviest artillery fire. In these streets the shops continued to trade as usual, although the blood of the Chinese soldiers holding the city was flowing down the sidewalk. For Japanese air units, however, the war in China was not too difficult. The war in the air was shaping up in our favor. 16 months after my arrival in Zhejiang, our troops had advanced far into enemy territory, and we had at our disposal relatively good facilities of the Hankou airfield. Our entire unit was relocated there. By this time, the Japanese newspapers described my first victory over an enemy fighter in colors and colors. A letter came from my mother, imbued with pride for me. Her words were a balm to my soul. Of equal interest was a letter from Hatsuo Harukawa, my uncle's daughter, now 16 years old. Recently, my dad was appointed postmaster at Tokushima on the island of Shikoku. I am now a student at Tokushima High School for Women. As you can easily imagine, it is very different from the one in Tokyo. Your letter shocked me. It brought great joy to all my classmates. Every day we open the newspapers hoping to find a new report about you. We want to make sure we haven't missed any news of our air victories in China. I'd like you, Saburo, to meet my best friend here in Tokushima. This is Mikiko Niori. Mikiko is the prettiest girl in our class and the smartest. Her father is a professor at a college in Kobe. Of all the classmates I showed your letter to, she was most impressed by it, and she asked me to introduce you. The letter included a picture of Hatsuo and Mikiko standing side by side, as well as a letter from a girl I had never seen before. She really was as pretty as Hatsuo said she was. I was interested to read her colourful description of the city and the story about her family. The letters from home made me very happy, and now I even started humming while working. I remember this day quite distinctly. October 3rd, 1939. I had just finished reading the mail, and was now cleaning the machine guns on my airplane. There was peace and quiet on the airfield. What was there to worry about? We were smashing the Chinese and foreign pilots every time we met them in the air. Suddenly, the silence was broken by loud yells from the flight control tower, and quite suddenly, without any warning, a terrible rumble shook the air. The ground began to bounce and shake, the shockwave hurting my ears. Someone shrieked, though it was no longer necessary air raid, and then the sirens wailed, though that warning was clearly overdue. We had no time to think. We had to try to run to the shelter. The rumble of exploding bombs became one continuous rumble. A cloud of smoke rose above the airfield, and I could hear the whistle of shrapnel flying in different directions. Several other pilots rushed with me from the workshop to the shelter. I ducked low to avoid being hit by the flying shrapnel and landed on the ground between two large water tanks. And just in time, too. Soon the machine gun belt storehouse exploded with a terrible rumble in a cloud of smoke and fire. Then a series of bombs lay across the airfield. The explosions hurt our ears and covered us with earth. If I had hit the ground even a second later, it would have been the end. When the bombs finished bursting, I raised my head and looked to see what was happening. Through the continuous rumble of explosions, desperate screams and groans could be heard all over the airfield. The people lying around me were wounded. I crawled to the nearest pilot, but suddenly a sharp pain cut my body. I hastily groped myself and realized that my pants were soaked with blood. Although the pain was terrible, the wounds were fortunately shallow. And then I completely lost my head. I jumped to my feet and ran again. This time I raced toward the runway, glancing warily up at the sky every now and then. Overhead I noticed 12 bombers in a clear formation making a wide circle at an altitude of at least 20,000 feet. They were Russian twin-engine SB bombers, the main bombers of the Chinese Air Force. It would be pointless to deny the deadly effectiveness of their surprise attack. We were taken by surprise. Not a single person suspected anything until the bombs whistled down. When I surveyed the airfield, I experienced a great shock. Most of the 200 Army and Navy bombers, lined up wing to wing on long taxiways, were now blazing. High columns of flame rose as fuel tanks exploded, huge puffs of smoke flying into the air. Those planes that were not yet burning were riddled with many pieces of shrapnel. From the punctured tanks, jets of gasoline spurted. The fire threw from plane to plane, greedily devouring gasoline. And now the bombers and fighters, one after another, embraced the flames. Bombers were exploding like firecrackers, fighters were burning like boxes of matches. I ran around the burning planes as if I were crazy, desperately trying to find even one whole fighter. By some miracle, a few clods, standing separately, had escaped destruction. I jumped into the cockpit, started the engine and, without waiting for it to warm up, drove the fighter down the track. The bombers were gradually gaining altitude, but my faster fighter was slowly catching up with them. I pushed the throttle all the way forward, squeezing every drop of speed out of the resentfully roaring Mitsubishi. 20 minutes after takeoff, I was almost on par with the enemy planes, having climbed to such an altitude that I could already open fire on their unprotected bellies. I didn't care at all that I was piloting the only fighter plane in the air. It was clear to me that a lightly armed Claude could not pose a serious threat to 12 bombers. Below me was the city of Yichang, which was still held by Chinese troops. If I was shot down here, and if I escaped from the falling airplane, a sure and terrible death awaited me at the hands of Chan's soldiers. But I did not hesitate to attack. Precisely because I had been brought up in the samurai tradition, only one thought possessed me to inflict the heaviest possible losses on the enemy. I was catching up with them from behind, and so far I was just below the trailing bomber. The enemy noticed me, which was reported by the flashing lights of machine gun fire. But the enemy gunner failed to hit the Claude, and I got as close as possible, then opened fire on the left engine of the plane. As I sped past, and was above the bomber, I noticed smoke billowing from the engine I had fired on. The bomber left the formation and began to lose altitude. I turned around and dived on it to finish it off. But I never made it. Already when I pushed the handle forward, I remembered that I was at least 150 miles west of Hankou. The extra bomber chase meant that I simply wouldn't have enough fuel to get back to base. I would have to land in enemy territory. If you risk your life in combat, that's one thing. If you just put both yourself and the airplane at risk for nothing, that's quite another. To continue the attack would be suicidal until extreme measures were necessary. I turned for home. Whether the Russian bomber made it to its airfield or not, I certainly don't know. But the worst that threatened its crew was a forced landing among their own. Back in Hanko, I realized that the 12 bombers had inflicted simply monstrous damage on the base. Almost all of our airplanes were either burned or wrecked. The base commander had lost his left arm, several of his officers, and many pilots, technicians, and mechanics were either dead or wounded. I forgot about my own wounds. The heat of the chase and the fever of battle made me temporarily forget about the pain. But I took only a couple steps away from the plane and fell to the ground. The wounds healed slowly. A week later, while I was still lying in the hospital, I received a letter from Hatsuo, with news no less terrible than the defeat of the airfield by the enemy. It is very, very hard for me to write this letter. But I have terrible news for you. My dear friend Mikiko was killed in a traffic accident on October 3rd. I am just crying as I write this. I'm shocked to the core. I'm almost angry with God. Why should such a wonderful girl like Mikiko die at the age of 16 without the slightest fault on her part? I hate myself for having to report this to you, the fighter pilot who is now fighting. But who else will do it? Hatsuo's letter contained a sealed envelope from Mikiko's mother. She wrote, "The unfortunate Mikiko, along with Hatsuo-san, told us about you every day. She waited anxiously for your reply to the letter she sent through Hatsuo-san. But your wonderful letter did not arrive until the day of Mikiko's funeral. Oh, how happy she would have been if she had been able to read it before she died. She was a wonderful daughter, kind, beautiful, a true angel. Maybe that's why the Almighty God took her so early. I don't know. I cry all day long. I know you will be pleased to know that your letter was placed in her urn and went with her to heaven. Please accept my and my husband's deepest thanks for writing to her. We will pray that Mikiko's spirit will protect you in heaven from enemy bullets." I didn't know what to think. I was just stunned and lost my ability to reason. A few hours later, lying on my bed and looking up at the ceiling, I began to compose a long letter to Mikiko's mother, trying to express my sympathy for her terrible loss. In this letter, I enclosed a small amount of money for the family to lay tributes on the girl's grave, as was the ancient custom. For several days, I was anxious to get home to see my family, to talk to my mother, brothers, and sisters. I did not have to wait too long to return to Japan. 2 days later, I received orders to go on rotation to the Omura Air Regiment. This airbase was very close to my village. My departure could hardly be called solemn. The flight commander warned me with a stone face for reasons of military secrecy. You must not tell anyone in Japan about the disaster. Do you understand? I replied, "That's right. For reasons of military secrecy, I must not tell anyone in Japan about the disaster." I then saluted and went to the airfield to take a seat in the transport plane that was to take me home. I returned to Omura base in a gloomy mood. The crushing attack on our airfield, during which many of my close friends had been killed, Mikiko's death, and my own wounds had left me depressed. Moreover, although the airbase was not far from my home, I was not allowed to visit my family until my wounds were finally healed. I was apprehensively awaiting my first meeting with Omura's flight commander. When I arrived here last year, his contempt and unfriendliness toward the cadets was quite openly displayed. But when I stood at attention in front of his desk, to my great surprise, the second-rank captain smiled broadly. For a few seconds he looked at me, scrutinizing my uniform, my face, my eyes, which looked strictly according to regulations straight ahead. However, he was simply glowing. I did not know it, but the news of my single-handed attack on 12 Russian bombers, although it did not end in success, had already become known in Japan. I was no longer an insignificant cadet to be yelled at by the captain of the second rank. He informed me that I could stay in Omura to rest in peace. I wouldn't even be called to duty for a while. This turn of events took me aback. I had never been treated like this before. Already in the mess hall, I realized that my flights in China, the downed airplane and the Russian bomber attack, had turned me into a small hero for the cadets who trained at this base. It was strange and gratifying to see people gather around me to hear stories of air warfare on the Asian mainland. During the week I rested, which I needed badly, and also followed the cadets' training flights. Then I received a letter from a girl whose name was unfamiliar to me. Fujiko Niori wrote to me, "I am Mikiko's sister, and I want to take this opportunity to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your letter to my mother and also for your warm words and attitude toward my little sister. Your letter has been a ray of sunshine for our family in the abyss we have been plunged into since Mikiko's death. I am not ashamed to admit that we all cried when Mikiko left us for a place where she will be happier. I must confess that before I read your letter, I was sure that all fighter pilots were only interested in war, that they were all rude, unfeeling people. Your letter has completely changed my opinion. If you allow me, I would sincerely like to become your friend, especially in memory of my sister. I shall be perfectly happy if you see fit to reply to this letter." The envelope contained a portrait of Fujiko. I must say that this 18-year-old girl was even prettier than her sister. I immediately wrote back, telling her that I had been slightly wounded in China and was now back in Japan for final treatment. I wrote that the doctors had promised me that I would soon start flying again, and that I hoped to see her in the near future. Just a couple days later, a new letter arrived from her. Fujiko described in detail life in the city of Tokushima on the island of Shikoku, and all the events taking place there. For the next few months I had little to do at Omura Air Base, and I spent a lot of time writing letters to Fujiko. I wrote a lot myself and reread her messages several times each. Her letters were written in a very elegant style, and I wondered whether the girl wrote them all herself, or whether the letters were edited by her mother, which was quite common. In November 1939, I received my first per diem leave for the whole year so that I could visit my family and see my mother. My wounds had finally healed, and I was glad to go home. The train journey took no more than an hour. I knew that back home the rice was ripe and the harvest had begun. The fields should be harvested by winter, but that was no longer my concern. After I left China, my home province seemed like a garden compared to the devastation there. And I admired the surrounding countryside on the railroad. I looked at the beautiful Kyushu mountains rising into the sky, the lush green forests, the rivers sparkling in the sun. I couldn't believe my eyes as I walked down the road to my old, small house. A large crowd had gathered in the courtyard, looking out onto the road. As soon as people noticed me, they broke out into shouts of welcome. I was surprised to see that my mother was accompanied by none other than the village headman himself. But not only this honourable gentleman came out to greet me. Almost all the village officials crowded around, waving their hands joyfully. The village headman proclaimed in a loud voice, "Welcome home, Saburo, hero of our humble village." I was simply dumbfounded. I had never even dreamed of anything like this. I was embarrassed and tried to explain to the headman that I was not a hero, that I was just a non-commissioned officer who had managed to shoot down a Russian fighter plane. He interrupted me, No, stop being modest. It's a very good quality, but we all know very well that you were awarded a silver imperial watch for your achievements at the Naval Flying School, and that you are considered one of the most promising pilots in the country. I could not utter a word. Before me flashed the events of 5 years ago when I left on the same road, the shame of my family and the whole village, when childhood friends hastily averted their eyes, ashamed of me. Did all these people suspect how I thrashed about in my cabin in the first battle, or how my commander was furious at me for being a fool? And now, it's all in the past. It was amazing. Then the celebration began on the small patio. There were mountains of food and many bottles of sake rice vodka. I was still reeling from the welcome I received, but my mother took me aside and whispered, "They have been so kind to us. All this food they put together to celebrate your return. Don't frown or get angry. Be polite as you know how to be." Those present wanted to hear about everything that was happening in China. They kept demanding that I tell in minute detail about my fight with a Russian fighter and how I attacked a formation of Russian bombers. It was strange to hear these old men, who were highly respected in our village, marvel at what I had done. But the most marvellous thing was my mother's shining eyes, which radiated with pride in her son. The rest of my kinfolk, my 3 siblings, put on their finest clothes. They sat, happy and smiling, and just admired what was happening. I didn't have much time left to talk to my mother. The festivities dragged on almost all night. When the guests left, I realized that our family remained as poor as it was when I joined the Navy. My mother did her best to allay my fears, assuring me that the entire village was now helping her with her work, and our neighbors just couldn't be kinder. While serving in China, I sent most of my paycheck home to my family. There was simply nowhere to spend the money in China. I never drank and had little interest in girls, but there were unwritten rules of conduct for pilots, and I didn't want to stand out from the rest. My mother continued, "Saburo, we are very grateful that you continue to help us by sending home your salary. But I wanted you to stop that. You're sending money that you might need yourself. Now is the time to start thinking about yourself. You need to start saving for your wedding." I protested vehemently. I had managed to raise a considerable amount of money, but I wasn't going to get married for the foreseeable future. Suddenly I remembered Fujiko, from whom I received letters almost daily. It suddenly dawned on me that if I had stayed in the village instead of joining the Navy and becoming a naval aviator, her family would not have allowed her to even speak to me. After returning to Omura, the base flight commander put me back in the air. I began a series of training flights to regain my fighter control skills. In mid-January 1940, I found my name on a bulletin board in an order which announced that I, along with several other pilots, was to participate in a demonstration flight over the large industrial city of Osaka on February 11th to celebrate the nation's Foundation Day. I hastily wrote a letter to Fuko, telling her about it. In her reply letter, she asked where I would be staying in Osaka, since my parents and myself want to meet you that day, a visit from her family. It was a high honor, as they would have to spend a whole day on the road to get from Tokushima to Osaka across the inland sea. The demonstration flight went perfectly. Japan looked beautiful from the air, clean and neat rice and barley fields, well-kept gardens and parks. I saw kids who were lined up in schoolyards with the letters of the word Banzai as our airplanes flew over them. In the afternoon it was over and we headed to our hotel rooms in Osaka. Hardly had I had time to shave and put on a fresh tunic when one of the non-commissioned officers came rushing in and enviously reported Pilot Sakai. "Come out. Your fiancé wishes to see you." Everyone laughed and started joking, but I blushed and dashed out of the room. And then I saw Fujiko. I froze on the stairs and just stared at her, holding my breath. She was dressed in a beautiful kimono and was waiting for me with her parents in the lobby. I could barely speak, and it cost me a lot of effort to tear my gaze away from the girl. I even began to stutter. That evening, the Niori family took me as a guest to one of Osaka's poshest restaurants. I'd never been to a place like that before. Fujiko's parents liked me, and they were genuinely courting me, but I couldn't help but feel a little awkward. It was clear to everyone, they, Fujiko, and me, that I was being considered and studied as a potential suitor. What bothered me even more was that the Niori family was one of the most famous in Japan. They came from a very noble samurai family, and Fujiko's father had achieved success by becoming a college professor. During dinner, I declined the cup of sake that Niori-san poured for me. He smiled and persuaded me to drink it, until I told him I didn't drink at all, because I was a fighter pilot. It was noticeable that my answer pleased all of them. The night flew by all too quickly, and in the morning we said goodbye, and, as it turned out, goodbye for a very long time. Although no one said so, it was clear that I was accepted as a future husband. Back in Omura, I resumed my hard training. Spring ended, summer flew by, and I was still stuck in Omura, cursing the fate that kept me in the training unit. The only thing that comforted me was the frequent letters from Fujiko. They made me dream and hope. But soon my mood soured again. I received a letter from a comrade who was still fighting in China. He reported that the personal score of each of the pilots continued to rise. Almost all of them had already become aces. The enemy was so intimidated that he unconditionally gave us complete dominance in the air. But finally came the good news: I was transferred to the airbase Kaohsiung, located on Formosa. It had been a whole year since I returned from China, and I was eager to fight again. By this time, Kaohsiung had become a major Japanese airbase, and my transfer there foreshadowed my imminent transfer to a frontline squadron. Before I left, however, I bought something I had long dreamed of. It was a Leica camera with an excellent lens, which was considered the best camera in the world. Such a camera would hardly be considered the most necessary thing by many people, especially since its price was equal to my 3-month salary. I spent almost all my savings, but I was still satisfied. The Leica was a beautiful camera, a real diamond. I saw a special use for it. Our fighters didn't have submachine guns, which American pilots were used to, and the Leica was perfect for shooting from the cockpit of a fighter plane. In Kaohsiung, a pleasant surprise awaited me. At the airfield, I saw unusual new fighters, different from the familiar Claude as the sky from the ground. They were modern Mitsubishi Zero fighters. The Zero excited me like nothing I had ever seen before. Even on the ground, the airplane seemed beautiful. It had a sleek, streamlined shape. Finally, we had a closed cockpit, a powerful engine, retractable landing gear. Instead of 2 light machine guns, the new fighter carried 2 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns. Zero was almost twice the speed and range of the Claude. The airplane was very sensitive. It responded to every touch of the control stick. After receiving these new marvelous aircraft, we could not wait to meet the enemy. The first test of the new fighter was during the occupation of French Indochina, when it covered our army occupying key towns. This meant a non-stop flight from Kaohsiung to Hainan Island. For a fighter plane, such a distance was simply unthinkable, also because almost the entire flight was over the ocean. But we did it without any problems. It was simply amazing, as everyone was used to the unfortunate short-legged clods. There was no resistance in the air. We simply patrolled in the air over our troops moving along the roads of Indochina, barring minor skirmishes on the borders, which were probably just a misunderstanding. Our troops moved without any interference. Of course, the peaceful occupation was the result of an agreement with the local French authorities, and therefore did not escalate into open warfare. Combat tests of the Zero were postponed. We returned to Hankou in May 1941 on a rotational basis, and only then tested them. Back in China, we found that the enemy pilots had lost all their fighting spirit. They were no longer aggressive and persistent in their attacks like those 3 Russian fighters who attacked 15 clods in my first battle. Now, the enemy pilots tried to get away at the first opportunity, and only took the fight if they succeeded in a surprise attack from the sun. Their cowardice forced us to fly deeper and deeper into enemy territory to engage them. On August 11th, 1941, I participated in one such operation. It was an 800-mile non-stop flight from Yichang to Chengdu. The terrain was familiar to me. It was over Yichang, which was then in Chinese hands, that I attacked 12 Russian bombers. During our sortie, we escorted 7 Mitsubishi Type 1 twin-engine bombers, which became known as Betty bombers during World War II. Shortly after midnight, the bombers took off from Hankou, and we met them over Yichang. The night was dark, and our only landmark was the gleaming Yangtze River, which meandered below in the impenetrable blackness. We arrived at the Pingxian airfield before dawn and began circling over it, waiting for sunrise. Finally, the sky brightened. The enemy fighters never showed up. We watched as the group commander shook the wings of his Zero and began to dive. That was the signal to attack. One by one, we darted from the airfield, where I spotted Russian fighters that had already started to taxi for takeoff. Mechanics were rushing all over the airfield, trying to take cover in the trenches. I came out of the dive at low altitude, landing behind one I-16 that was already starting to scatter across the field. It was a perfect target, and a short cannon burst made the plane explode. I swept over the entire airfield and went overhead, turning off to the right to repeat the approach. Machine gun trails and bursting shells flashed from all sides, but the unexpectedly high speed of the Zero knocked out the sight of the enemy anti-aircraft gunners. The remaining Zeros took turns dive bombing and strafing the runways. Several Russian fighters caught fire or crashed. I came out of the dive again and caught sight of the next plane. Again a short cannon burst, and a ball of flame flashed on the ground. There were no more targets worth shelling. Our attack finished off all the planes on the airfield. Not a single Russian fighter had time to take off. They were all burning and exploding. As we climbed to an altitude of 700 feet, we noticed that the hangars and warehouses were burning none the less brightly after the bomber attack. It was a fine job. We were somewhat disappointed at the lack of air resistance and continued to circle in place, hoping that the rising columns of smoke would attract enemy fighters. Suddenly 3Os went out of formation and rushed down. Far below, I could make out a brightly coloured biplane that was literally clinging to the ground. Our 3 fighters, like lightning, rained down on it, showering it with bullets and shells, but to no avail. The skillful enemy pilot threw his machine to the right and left, using all the maneuverability of his slow-moving plane to dodge the cues. Our fighters soared overhead, leaving the biplane alone. Now it was my turn. I caught the biplane in the crosshairs and pressed the throttle. However, he now dodged so steeply turned to the left that even the maneuverable Zero was not able to repeat this maneuver. Another Zero tried to attack him, and just as unsuccessfully. 5 of our planes were darting back and forth, trying to catch a glimpse of the nimble enemy. This pilot was a consummate craftsman. His biplane seemed like a ghost. He laid down turns, made loops, snakes, flips. He made figures that seemed impossible, and there was no way we could intercept him with a line. But suddenly we were near a small hill west of Chengdu. The biplane pilot had to go over this hill, and his plane made a slow barrel roll. He made only one mistake, but that mistake proved fatal to the pilot. The belly of the biplane flashed on my scope, and the shells tore through it exactly in the cockpit area. The biplane tumbled haphazardly downward, and another Zero threw an unnecessary line into the plane flown by the dead man. It crashed into a hill and exploded. It was my second victory, and my first in a Zero. That flight was my last in the Chinese theatre. Shortly afterward, we were transferred to the small town of Yunqin on the Yellow River. During several weeks of patrolling, we never met a single enemy airplane. In early September, all naval pilots were assembled in Hankou, where, quite unexpectedly, Vice Admiral Aikichi Katagiri, commander of naval aviation in China, appeared before us. The admiral told us that we were all being transferred to Formosa, where we had a very important mission to perform. The admiral didn't elaborate, but we were all well aware that a major war with the Western powers was about to break out. It was simply inevitable. In September, we returned to the island. A total of 150 fighter pilots and the same number of bomber crews were transferred from Kaohsiung to Hainan, where a new air flotilla Hainan was being formed. And soon thunder rumbled in the Pacific.